On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, a back office backup at the Department of Defense, an innovation jumpstart for national security, and the real demand signal for military autonomy. Welcome to Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. 43% of the Defense Department's spending on major business programs is going to only 4 of those programs. Those 4 have some things in common. Vijay D'Souza is Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the Government Accountability Office. Vijay, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. What did you look at when you looked at these 24 business programs, and what did you find that they had in common, and what was disparate among them?
Well, we do this review every year, and as you mentioned, we look at DOD's major IT business systems investments. We typically look at 3 things. First, we look at where they are with regards to cost and schedule. Second, we look at the extent to which they're applying appropriate leading practices in cybersecurity and software development. And then finally, we look at overall policy and programmatic changes that DOD is implementing to try to improve its efforts in this area.
Mm-hmm. And what were the threads that you saw among all 24 or among the big 4 that we'll talk about in a moment?
Well, for better or worse, a common theme from year to year is cost and schedule delays. This year we found that 14 of the 24 programs we looked at experienced cost or schedule changes. Most of those were cost increases or schedule delays. The median cost increase was $173 million, and the median schedule delay was 15 months. Unfortunately, that's something that we see with a lot of government IT projects.
What's your sense of what's driving that? What did you find were the factors that were causing that?
The programs we talk to typically identify issues such as requirements, identifying requirements for what the system's supposed to do, and these things change over time. There's typically challenges with testing, and then also staffing and workforce issues.
One item that was supposed to help software developers in general, not just in the Defense Department, to meet schedule requests, to meet timelines better, was agile software development. I note in your work, 11 DOD IT business programs reported actively developing software using recommended agile and iterative software development approaches and practices. That's out of 24. Is that a problem, or is that just a factor of doing business?
Yeah, actually, that was a good news story in the sense that those were the only projects that were in active software development. So we would expect them to be using Agile. The fact that they were using Agile as opposed to an older waterfall approach is actually a good news story. The bad news part of that is a few of the programs, although they said they were using Agile, weren't actually able to demonstrate through using some of the tools and processes that DoD requires for its programs that use Agile.
What are some of the tools that those programs should be using that maybe other programs that come along at some future point should be sure to keep in mind?
Well, DoD has a publication that lists a number of them, but just 2 examples are things such as a cumulative flow diagram and a burn down chart, and these are just ways to track and organize requirements for software development.
You also write 2 programs did not have an approved cybersecurity strategy. That sounds problematic in the context of how often the department talks all across the services, from OSD, the Office of the CIO, about the importance of cybersecurity and cyber defense.
Yeah, it is a problem, and we do think it's a problem. We made a recommendation in the 2022 version of this report because at that point we found 10 programs that didn't have approved cybersecurity strategies. So I would say 2 is an improvement, but really they should all have these strategies.
That's what I was thinking as you're conveying that. 10's better than 2, or 10's worse than 2, but 2 is worse than 0. Is
Correct.
0 attainable in something like this, especially given how important cybersecurity is? Is that doable?
I mean, every major program should have a cybersecurity strategy. There's no question.
You also write 4 programs had not developed plans to implement zero trust architecture in their cybersecurity frameworks by DOD's 2027 deadline. That also strikes me as problematic, and I wonder, is it an issue where they didn't demonstrate it, which doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have zero trust architecture available, it's just that you couldn't see it, or was it not there when you examined?
Well, the reasons for these 4 programs to not have the strategy varied a little bit, and we talked about this when we were developing the report. We didn't make a recommendation here yet because the 2027 deadline hasn't yet occurred, and some of the programs had valid reasons. They were going to rely on another component strategy, and that strategy wasn't yet done. But our concern as we do this in future years is going to be, do they hit that deadline? I mean, I would say honestly, if they don't have the strategy by next year, 2027 is around the corner. It's going to be difficult for them to achieve it.
We just have a couple of minutes left, but you've made the point a couple of times that this is an ongoing body of work on your team's part. What's the arc that you see overall? It's hard, I guess, to take a snapshot of 1 year and see where the department is headed. Is it a couple of times you've alluded to good news stories? Is it your sense that overall they're headed in the right direction with still some work to do, or are there still some major challenges that the department has to deal with?
Well, we think that the folks at DOD and the CIO's office in particular are trying hard to address some of these issues, and part of what we cover is some of the guidance and tools and stuff they put in place, but they're really not there yet. The other thing I want to mention is, as we look at different issues from year to year, for example, this year was the first year we looked at artificial intelligence. That's something we'll start to look at in more detail as it becomes more widespread.
Vijay, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks, it was great to be here.
You can find a link to the work that Vijay talked about on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, an innovation jumpstart for national security. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose continues in just a moment.
Innovation doesn't wait, and neither do we. At Maximus, we solve problems. Streamlining operations, delivering solutions at speed and scale that drive measurable results. From strategy to execution, we simplify complexity, building trust through expertise and innovative technology. Every service, every time. Efficient government delivered. We don't follow innovation, we drive it. Maximus.
They're building little practice groups where they're really finding, hey, this works really well for my workflow. And that's what I mean by empowering the frontline employees, because we're not going to be the ones to decide, or I think it would be a mistake for us to think here in DC that we can decide how this should be used. The people on the front lines know what their problems are. We need to give them the tools, and they're going to create solutions that we never expected.
One of the things that we've done is a skills store. And that skills store is basically born out of these communities of practice and the best use cases. And rather than having people go back in and say, where was that prompt that someone did, or where is that document library that people are using, creating these micro applications within the enterprise tools that people can call.
Welcome back. Army Futures Command's merger with Training and Doctrine Command is underway now. The new organization will be called the Army Transformation and Training Command. Jeb Nadaner is Senior Vice President of Government Relations at Govini. He's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial Policy. Jeb, welcome. It's great to have you on the program. This Army change is just one example of how innovation units across DOD are changing and evolving. DIU is another one that is in the process of evolution. What's your sense of how these organizations have done at their mission of bringing more commercial technology into the department and bringing more non-traditional vendors into the defense industrial base?
Well, this journey with the innovation groups in DoD started roughly around 10 years ago. Two of the most successful ones have been Army Futures Command and DIU. DIU, I would just note, only recently got a proper budget from Congress, so it's been working on sort of fumes. But it's done good work nevertheless. Very promising organization. Army Futures Command is premier in terms of integrating non-traditionals. They have shown it is possible to really shorten the acquisition life cycle, to go from prototype to production to fielding very, very quickly. So I think it's a model for everyone else.
What do they do that the other services could do, and what do they do that is unique to the Army and its mission that might not be replicable in another organization?
Well, I think some of the things they're doing are very replicable. They're keeping requirements to the essential, not adding a lawyer's book to things. They are inviting in all companies. It's true competition with them. It's not just a show and okay, then we go with the usual ones. And they're mixing and matching, I think, the traditionals and non-traditionals really well. And it's all about outcomes and what they can get to the warfighter field quickly. So a lot of commendations to the Army on this.
I think the first discussion I had with somebody on this program about the Valley of Death had to be at least 10 years ago. And I'm curious what that looks like in your view today, whether it's easier for companies to get from award to delivery while still being able to stay in business, given the life cycle that a government contract takes.
Well, there's really two kinds of companies, non-traditionals. Some are dealing with the Valley of Death because they have an idea for a technology, but they need federal funding to get themselves over the valley. There's another kind of commercial company, non-traditional. They're paying their whole way. They're venture-backed. They live and survive based on their orders. So they don't really face that conventional Valley of Death. What they do need are orders. Because if not, typically they're commercial companies, so if the DOD won't buy, they'll then go to the commercial sector. And that would be a big loss for national defense.
Is there a role for companies like that to partner with other types of companies, to partner with big primes? What does the relationship fluidity look like in your view?
I think where it's going is, one is there's some things that the non-traditionals do better, particularly software. But there's some other things that they may be able to be very cost competitive, certainly rocket launch, maybe munitions. And there are going to be other areas where the combination of the traditional primes and all their expertise and all their infrastructure and assets with the non-traditionals becomes really powerful. And we just saw a great example of that in Israel. So the U.S. airmen performed wonderfully with the B-2s, but it's notable what the Israeli ecosystem did. Even with some U.S. technology, they have a much more mature model of integrating the startups and the traditionals. And you see very quick deployments and really amazing targeting. And other things like they fly the same F-35 we do, however, their availability rate, their sorties, are double of ours. That's because they're using modern commercial software in the sustainment of their airplanes. So same airplane comes out of Fort Worth, but a lot of ours are sitting in the hangar. The Israeli ones are up and operational.
What can we do that they're doing, and what would we have to change in the acquisition process, in the governance process, or whatever to get to that level?
I think a good starter would be follow the law. Congress has made all the acquisition streamlined laws that one could ask for. And they'll produce even more. But what's on the books is excellent. It's a question of following it. Second thing is follow the President and Secretary of Defense's guidance. They have been very clear with the DOD. Get on with it. You have all the authorities you need. So it's a question of sort of the big DOD middle actually feeling comfortable enough to say, okay, I can use these so-called new acquisition pathways, even though they're many decades old. But if we have a focus on results, then it'll be very clear that these pathways are the right way to go.
Jeb,
and we can get that kind of speed of the Israelis.
It's great to have you on the program, Jeb. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you. Wonderful.
You can read more about driving innovation in the Defense Department and in the DIB on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the real demand signal for military autonomy. Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose. We'll be right back.
And the secret to our sauce and our success has been that I have my IT team embedded with the software, with the agents and officers, and making sure that our solutions are responsive to their needs. And they tell us where the data is and how to use that data for certain software solutions. And I think that has been very, very key. They also actually sit with our software. I've got about 250 Agile teams. And this, again, I'm giving all my secrets away.
That's why I invited you. That's why.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. We want to share. But one of the successes is that the agents and officers sit with us. We learn from them. They learn from us. This is the art of the possible.
That's the area that we're super excited about kind of in the future. So it's not just about visibility, right? Visibility is kind of like your table stakes now. It's really been able to put that data into action, right? And actionability. And so imagine One of our most common use cases is identify my blind spots. So maybe give me all of the systems that are supposed to have a security agent on them, but don't for whatever reason. So we can identify that very easily. But the cool part is not only identify it, but then we can go back and work with the source tool to go put the right agent on the system. So that kind of automation is improving their overall defense posture for sure.
Welcome back. Each of the military services includes uncrewed or optionally crewed systems among the programs it's prioritizing. But there may be a disconnect between the Pentagon's strategy on autonomous vehicles and its budget lines. Timothy Walton is Senior Fellow with the Hudson Institute. Nick Guertin is founder of Guertin Transformation Associates and former Assistant Secretary for Research, Development, and Acquisition for the Navy, former Director of the Office of Operational Test and Evaluation at DOD. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining me today. Tim, I start with you. Your colleague Brian Clark of Hudson said recently that he sees that disparity that I mentioned a moment ago between what the Pentagon can buy with the budget that it's been given by Congress and what it needs from an autonomy perspective. What do you make of that disparity?
Yep, that's absolutely true. I think for years the Navy's recognized it needs to lean more into uncrewed systems. We've seen different force designs and 30-year shipbuilding plans that the Navy's laid out, starting to talk more and more about uncrewed systems across the classes of vehicles. And the Navy's also spent billions of dollars over the past decade on research, development, test, and evaluation, mostly. But it has relatively little to show on the procurement side. We now have a new administration that I think is interested in cultivating this burgeoning uncrewed vehicle industry, and many players are joining, mostly venture capital-backed startups. But the question is, well, how much funding is actually going to go to which ones? And part of the challenge is thinking through what are promising classes of operation, concepts of operation, ways in which military forces would fight, and then design classes so that the Navy could start to focus on some and start to drive procurement funding in that direction, as opposed to just this never-ending RDT&E cycle.
Is there a difference in your view in the way that's playing out with autonomous vehicles versus what's happened with other types of new developments in weapon systems in the past?
I think it is. So the Navy had its Task Force 59 in the Arabian Gulf, where they were slowly experimenting with unmanned vehicles and invited a range of performers to bring their kit and play in the Gulf and demonstrate it. But to date, there really hasn't been that clear transition to buying things at scale. Compared to some other previous programs in terms of weapons capabilities, there usually was a closer linkage between the two. So moving forward, I think it's going to be imperative for the administration to create that linkage, to actually start to drive funding towards the promising classes of vehicles and CONOPS that the Navy can scale.
Nick, welcome. It's good to have you back on the program. What's your sense of that disparity between what people see that the department says it wants, which has been very clear from both civilian personnel and uniformed personnel, and what the Congress has allowed the department to buy?
It's been a very interesting development in how the budget has been put together recently. Congress hasn't fully fleshed out what their story is on that, but they have parked some resources for buying a fairly significant amount, several $1 billion worth of medium unmanned systems. The PEO for unmanned and small combatants recently did an industry day and put out an RFP. So we're seeing movement in that direction. I think as we start expending those resources and building out some of those things that, as we mentioned, had shown operational utility, then some of the other bills will have to come. Like, oh, you build these things, where are you going to put them? Where are you going to tie them up? How are you going to maintain them? So all of those other aspects of a fully vetted budget commitment will start to come to fruition as this year and next year play out.
And I think if we look back maybe 5 years ago, when we were generating some of these fleet architecture studies, there were a number of people in Congress who said, okay, it's great that you're interested in having these long endurance, Pacific operating unmanned vehicles, but the maturity isn't there. So Congress started spending a considerable amount of money on land-based engineering to buy down some of the risks, some at-sea testing capabilities. We're now starting to approach the point where some of those capabilities are maturing. So as you mentioned, Nick, in terms of the medium unmanned surface vessel, they're narrowing down from having a variety, they used to have this focus on large unmanned surface vessels, medium unmanned surface vessels, multiple varieties of them. They're trying to focus maybe on one type of medium unmanned surface vessel onto which they can put 8 Tomahawk-sized missiles, some other sensors, and then focus on the attributes. The one concern I will have regarding what the Navy did put out in that industry day is they seem to be focused on a vessel that could go pretty fast, 25 knots. So it can keep up with the larger cruisers, destroyers in the fleet, but it can only do so at 2,500 nautical mile range. So that means they would need to refuel pretty frequently, which maybe undercuts some of the more promising concepts of operation, where you could send these uncrewed vehicles on their own to be able to scout or to be able to attack enemy forces.
Some of the testing that Tim talked about undoubtedly happened on your watch. What did you see when you were in that role, and how are you seeing that manifest itself now in what people are both asking for and in the capabilities that companies are delivering?
So one of the challenges with fully autonomous surface vessels going out over the span of thousands of miles is that we don't actually know whether or not that's going to work. And so having an operational concept looking good on paper, but experimenting with it at sea and validating that those, or finding new approaches, that's going to be a big part of using these vessels that we're about to make this commitment to buy, and how the fleet ends up using them, and then where those big bets get laid down. I'm especially impressed, if you will, by those organizations doing what I asked them to do, which is to think about the modularity aspect of it and how to change out the payload capacities of these vessels so that you can mix and match different kinds of effectors or sensors depending on what the operational needs would be.
It's always better when the director gets what he wants, is what I understand, as to how it works inside the building. What's your takeaway from what you're seeing, though, in places like the Middle East, in places like Ukraine, about what organizations are doing on the fly, and not even organizations necessarily. Sometimes it's individual people or small organizations within militaries about what they're doing, Nick, on the fly, and what's the implication for that in an organization like the Defense Department or one of the branches?
So what's happening in Ukraine is worthy of study for a long time. But first and foremost, they're fighting in their backyard. We need to span the tyranny of distance. And so we need to have capacity that will go far and be there with substantial firepower. That's a different problem that we've seen Ukraine have to do in their backyard. However, they've done some very interesting things in terms of populating basically a vehicle with lots of payloads in it and parking it somewhere far away. That's very interesting, worthy of study, and that's something we can replicate on and advance the practice.
And I imagine that's a strategic element as well as a hardware element. There are a lot of different ways that can go. Am I on the right track?
Absolutely, and one of the things that we need to think about is how do we leverage the new development tools that are burgeoning now? How does artificial intelligence all the way through the development stack, how do we think about what we want? How do we systems engineer the different activities? How do we build out the different capacities? And then how to build out the individual pieces that will do all that work? It's a very exciting time to be in this business.
Tim, you wanted to add something?
Yep, I think the most important lesson is just operational adaptation. It doesn't really matter how good of a capability you start the war with, but how quickly can your organization adapt and set up the processes so that you can learn from the environment, and quickly adapt in terms of pushing new software upgrades and fielding new hardware. I think the U.S. Navy is trying to learn some lessons from its operations in the Red Sea and was able to do this at some scale. But I think Ukraine does show us how we need to be able to do this on the hardware side too, and be able to field different classes of hardware. It also, I think, illustrates how maybe we don't want to take a one-size-fits-all approach to force design. We were talking about MUSV, and I think that's going to be an important element of the fleet, but it really shouldn't be the only one. We should be talking about this heterogeneous architecture of small unmanned surface vessels that are basically surfboard-sized things on the surface of the water, numerous unmanned underwater vehicles that have long endurance, lethal mines that could be sowed in a crisis or conflict, and then maybe even larger unmanned underwater vehicles. I think the Navy, as it thinks about a conflict against China, as Nick was alluding to, it faces maybe two solution paths. One is to try to better defend itself on the surface. More air missile defenses, more decoys and the like, and unmanned systems can help with that. The other path, though, is to submerge portions of the fleet, go underwater. And that entails buying more submarines faster and hopefully giving some to the Australians while we're at it. But it also entails thinking through what are large diameter unmanned underwater vehicles that we can have. And part of the challenge the Navy's faced with is that
Our mental model for what that should be largely looks at a submarine. We're going to build a submarine that's sub-safe standards under the water, and that's very expensive. When our model probably should be more of a narco sub, what drug cartels are using to transoceanically ship cocaine and other products, and basically use a narco sub that can deliver logistics, that can deliver missiles, that can deliver torpedoes at great distances, that can be manufactured easily, and that helps both in terms of a conflict, but it also helps you tap into a much broader defense industrial base.
Tim, Nick, thanks very much for joining me. It's great to have both of you on the program. Thank you very much. You can read more about autonomous vehicles in DOD on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in just a moment.
Great example I love to share is in the science domain. We work with the U.S. National Labs, and we did a 1,500 scientist hackathon a couple months ago, where we had 1,500 scientists across the national labs use our models to try to advance the research they were doing. There's one scientist out of Brookhaven National Lab who's a physicist, leading physicist in his area of expertise. He got our reasoning models, the O3 mini model at the time, and went in within ChatGPT and asked the model, what do you know about this area of physics? It said back, he's like, all right, great, we're going to advance this together. And throughout that conversation, he was actually able to create net new science that had never existed, and actually published the paper where he calls out the ChatGPT model as part of his co-author to really help him create this idea.
The past 5 to 8 years, we're seeing not just the attacks increase, but also the successful attacks that have physical consequences in those environments skyrocket. Right? So you need to look at your environment and say, what is an architecture that will serve me well to what I know today into the next 4 or 5 years? Design it and then go implement it versus still dealing with the challenges of the past.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, the technologies shaping the future of defense, intelligence, and homeland security are the focus of TechNet Emergence 2025. AFCEA International will host it July 15th and 16th at the Hyatt Regency in Reston, Virginia. You'll see leaders from government, industry, and academia and learn how cutting-edge tech will shape the national defense and national security landscape. You can see the speaker list and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. FedGov Today TV's back next Sunday morning at 10:30. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today.